welcome to another episode of the Know Your Compliance podcast. I am extremely excited about today's conversation. I'm normally excited about my conversations, but this one I'm particularly excited about. It's something that internally I've felt some pressure from our team that we really should be talking about this more. And I know that in my own journey as a COO of an anti-money laundering company, I've had a lot to learn. And so to be able to have Jinisha join me today is terrific. So let me start with a bit of an introduction. By the way, I should say our topic primarily is going to be human trafficking and the impacts in Canada. So with that, Jinisha, thank you for joining me. And I will give you a bit of an introduction as to who you are in a second.
I'm so thrilled, Greg. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So just to set the scene as to why Jinisha Bhatt is an anti-financial crime consultant, human trafficking investigator, does a lot of work in fraud detection, both in Canada, United States, around the world at this point in time. Jinisha's worked in banks, doing money laundering, human trafficking investigation, and about 6 years ago, decided to kind of join the fight against human trafficking in a more serious way by joining forces with survivors and leaders. She teamed up with a group of organizations and law enforcement to identify human trafficking victims using open source intelligence, and is now the leader of a collective known as the Canadian Anti-Human Trafficking Consortium, CAHTC. And so CAHTC is a not-for-profit that Jinisha leads, and its goal is to foster widespread collaboration among private sector entities across Canada in the fight against human trafficking. So I truly cannot think of a better person to come talk with us about human trafficking. And I want to thank you for spending the time with us today. So Jinisha, let's jump right in. Let's start with, for our audience, a really broad, what is human trafficking? And is this really something that's happening in Canada of all places?
Yeah, great question. Let's start here. What is human trafficking? You know, the universal definition that everybody talks about, right, is human trafficking is the unlawful act of transporting or coercing people in order to benefit from their work or service, typically in the form of forced labor and sexual exploitation. I do like to challenge things, and so I'm going to challenge the definition, and many people do. It's not the unlawful act of transporting. I think that's where we get conflated.
Okay.
It does not require transport. So let's just say three words that are truly important to understand human trafficking: force, fraud, and coercion. And the world unanimously agrees on this. It's compelling a person, a victim, to use their bodies in ways they do not consent to, whether it be for sex or labor or marriage or organ donations and so on.
That's a pretty scary list pretty quickly, in fact. And I think a lot of indeed, yeah. For the audience, we're taping this on November 1st, so fully appropriate for kind of a morbid topic. From when you start to talk through these, like organ harvesting, I hadn't even considered, but yeah, certainly sex trafficking is the one that gets a lot of the nastiest of the press, I suppose. But and we've talked about this a little bit, but it's not just that. So I think maybe go a little deeper on if you could, on some of these other facets of human trafficking that I don't think people necessarily associate with human trafficking.
Yeah, well, let's let's talk about what the United Nations says about Canada. And you asked me whether trafficking happens here. We'll get into that. But United Nations has said Canada is a breeding ground. Our temporary worker permit program, foreign worker program is a breeding ground for contemporary slavery. And they're asking us, they have been asking us what we're doing about it. So we are systematically exploiting temporary foreign workers for labor. And this is may or may not even be trafficking, because here is a government that says to businesses, hey, we are going to allow people to come here without any labor rights, without any human rights, and you can exploit them. No one will find out because they have no mechanisms to complain. But if you look at other forms of human trafficking, yes, sex trafficking gets a lot of PR, and definitely we should be concerned about that, because an average victim's age is about 12 to 17 years, right? And many, many young people are exploited in this act. Go on.
My oldest daughter is 12, so this is a terrifying statement you've just made. Tell me more. Oh my goodness.
And that's why I challenge the very definition. See, the idea is someone is forcefully brought somewhere to be trafficked. The
Hmm.
way many young people are exploited these days is online. They are lured into uh, sharing content, or forced to sell their content when someone else is profiting, right? They are extorted or sextorted.
Right. That okay. Well, that really broadens the scope of what we're talking about all of a sudden, because you do take that transport definition, that transport piece out of the definition, and suddenly I can see how this becomes very real and is something that's happening in Canada. There's no question about it.
You
Do
want to talk
you?
about how often it happens here?
Yeah. Let's go to prevalence. What's the numbers? What do you know?
Yeah. So last time we met, I told you about prevalence, but turns out I looked at the study again. This is a global database. They do a global slavery index,
Hmm.
and they've studied all these countries, including Canada. If you go to Canadian sources like StatsCan, you would see numbers like there have been, I think it's under 1,500 cases in the last 10 years. So since we started measuring between 2003 and between 2013 and 2023, there have been under 1,500 cases. So that kind of
That sounds
seems
terrific.
right, yeah, which only places about 1.1 individuals per 100,000 people at risk, or at risk of having been trafficked. However, if you
Wow.
look at the global global slavery index, and this is an index that studied comprehensive factors like poverty and people's living conditions and debt, and even things like corruption index and services available, they are saying that at least 69,000 people in Canada are actually living in modern day slavery. They're not, this is not a prevalence study. They're claiming they're living in
Like
modern slavery.
currently as we speak, that's a lot more than the stats can number. That's downright depressing all of a sudden.
Yeah, and that should tell you, that should give you an idea of what kind of systemic issues we face. The number one
Hmm.
issue is enforcement. And the number
Okay.
two issue, actually, I'd say the number one issue is identification. We haven't even identified more than 1%, more than half a percent of victims worldwide. And Canadians' stats, if anything, are more abysmal. And we haven't really done a good job of prosecuting. The prosecution rate globally is also 1%.
Whew, that's a lot to digest. So you're saying that the stats can numbers are
Mm.
pretty low, but by all reasonable metrics are way too low, way lower than the actual, and the actual might actually be vastly still underrepresenting the truth of the situation if we could actually get to the core of it, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Exactly. And I know your listeners are going to challenge that. How does, this lady know? Well, I know because it is my job to look at the data and to get the data. And we could get into that in a bit if you like. Yeah.
Well, let's do a little bit of that, because I don't want people to, one of the risks of talking about something like this is that you don't people just wash their hands and say, oh, this is so uncomfortable, I don't want to
Mm.
consider this possibility. So tell me why I should believe you. Let's go very core. Like what data do you bring that allows you to make that statement and gives you the confidence that that you're doing something worth doing, which by the way I'm on board with. I just want to make sure that our listeners kind of follow through with it. So
Okay, so I think the gloomy stuff has to end now. So let's talk about what is being done. This is really a more sanguine picture of where Canada could go in the future. I founded the Canada Anti-Human Trafficking Consortium after I learned from many survivor leaders, who are desperate to find victims, how to actually
Mm,
use data. So, we have to realize people have vulnerabilities that are exploited by traffickers, but so do traffickers, and their main vulnerability is that they have to market their product. Their product is the human
humans,
beings. Yeah.
right?
And so you look at the way these people are marketed. Of course, there are independent sex workers also marketing themselves, but they are not describing their bodies as a product, as an object. There are many indicators that would tell us what kind of ad you're looking at, the type of emojis used, or the number of times a phone number shows up, or even their
Hmm.
area codes. And trafficking is a transient crime, so we're looking at all of these factors. And it's said that every 30, or actually every minute, so every minute you can see multiple ads being posted online in Canada.
Okay.
And this is also very aligned with global stats. Wherever human trafficking is prevalent, every minute you have multiple new ads posted. And yeah.
And these are human trafficking ads, is what you're saying.
So there are sex ads, but then in this pile, you can look at indicators that show you how exploitation happens. Like, who are the people behind these ads? Why is the same person showing up over and over again on multiple forums in multiple cities, for example? And what kind of language is being used? And then you look at the metadata. There's so many indicators, like the tattoos. There are tattoos that traffickers put on their victims. These are like ownership
Like a
tattoos.
brand?
Essentially, yes, victims are branded in the sex trafficking game here and in the US. And so we look at all of that. We also look at particular keywords, like someone would say no law enforcement, or no, if you really want to get into it, some of them would say no African American men, or no on Black Canadians. And this is not to say that I discriminate against, certain types of clients. This is the trafficker or the advertiser suggesting, telling other pimps, hey, this is a pimp controlled person, so don't try to come here and steal my pimp, because
Wow.
yes, or sorry, steal my victim. So this is also signal. So we're looking at all of these types of indicators, and then we're trying to process the data, figure out where these people can be found, and then ultimately hand over that data to nonprofits, to survivor leaders who are in the business of doing outreach. That's how we actually get the victims out. And that's why we know these ads are working, because when the victims come out, they're corroborating all this information, right? They're telling us how they were trafficked. And
That's insane to me. Like, and so your team of volunteers are actually doing this open source work of reading through and sifting through these ads and looking for some of these indicators on these ads, and are then passing that on to people who can affect change in the, like, who can actually get these victims out of their situations. Is that what I'm hearing you tell me that your organization does? That's so cool, by the way. But
yeah, we're all about making a tangible impact. And by impact, I mean how many people we've saved. So, or not saved is definitely not the right word, extracted, I would say. But remember, I told you there are two very troubling stats here: victim identification and
mm-hmm.
prosecution. So,
Mm.
handing over that data to nonprofits is just one piece of the puzzle. You cannot solve this problem simply by placing victims in safe shelter. There will be more victims, and typically an average victim will be re-victimized about 5 to 13 times in her lifetime. And so,
Whoa.
yes, and that's because of very complex issues, challenges like, say, trauma bonding, or debt, or lack of services, or having children with a person who is a trafficker, all of those things.
So it occurs to me that, and this is true of so many different ways of fighting crime, that the actual solution would be to go after the traffickers somehow. And
Mm.
it sounds to me like that's even more challenging. Is that Is that what I'm hearing you kind of? Because if people are being re-victimized by the same traffickers, that tells me that there's some sort of systemic problem that continues to exist here. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I think traffickers seem to have an impunity up until now, up until very recently, since we changed our legislation a bit in 2014. We also had been really good at punishing victims, right? Because victims are easy to find. They are prostituting themselves. So you're going after the lowest hanging fruit as law enforcement, or used to at least. And
Mm-hmm.
now you're quite right. When you change your legislation, we say we decriminalize sex work for victims. We only want to go after the traffickers. Now people are even more confused because now we need a different set of skills to actually uncover the complex, like, layer of a trafficking network. And that's why the second piece that we really care about is prosecution. And that's also where our data is really very useful to A, law enforcement, but B, to anybody who is in the business of doing anti financial crime and anti money laundering, like
Mm-hmm.
yourself.
Well, and this is where there's an intersection that becomes interesting, and really why certainly we've as a company have become interested in this conversation is where is that intersection? What does that look like? Why should those of us working in anti money laundering I mean, I think you've elegantly made the case of why we should care. So I think we've probably covered that. But then, what should we be doing, and what could we be doing differently, and what what are the indicators we should be kind of thinking about as we go about our businesses? And
Okay.
that's a whole
So,
bunch of questions nested in one. So unpack them as you want, and we can come back to some of them for sure.
no, you're quite right. We don't always have to appeal to your humanity to do something. Yes, everybody should care. But what I find fascinating about our industry is we are the best equipped to care because
Hmm.
we have access to data that I don't have as an open source investigator. I don't have access to someone's PII, someone's transactions. And so, suppose I give you a whole bunch of data. We are working on an API, right? So, one day, say your firm comes across a suspicious character who's trying to get buy a property, and you use our API to look up their phone number, for example. Now, I can only give you the data that I see online. That is
Right.
not privately, personally identifiable information. But you are equipped to then take that data, match it with your consumer database, and say, there are some suspicions here. And now maybe we'll flag this person as a high risk or a person of interest and do our due diligence, do our enhanced due diligence. So I think we are very well equipped to actually make a difference. And what we're missing, and maybe we will talk more about that, what we're missing at the moment is collaboration. We can
Hmm.
all do this already. Like a lot of firms, private companies have these transaction monitoring tools that might very well be catching the data we do, but ours is a bit more sophisticated in that we're looking at layers upon layers of data that traditional adverse media companies may not be looking at. And then we are also doing our own manual investigations to supplement that. So I think we can actually make a big difference by talking to each other, talking to law enforcement, and talking to FinTrack.
Yeah. I mean, I think this has gone from being a perfect Halloween episode to being kind of really kind of positive and giving me some hope because I think and I think a lot of our definition around human trafficking there, our conversation around it focused a little bit on sex trafficking primarily, but I think there's just no question, and I guess maybe that's one thing we should have delved into, and maybe shouldn't wouldn't mind going back to for a second is what other offenses are involved are associated with human trafficking, and what's the harm to society? We talked about the harm to the victims certainly, but what else happens as a result of this, and what else is involved there? What are the other predicate offenses?
I love that question. Uh, I think I should have defined earlier. Human trafficking is the second most profitable crime after drug trafficking. So currently, we're talking about a $250 billion industry for all
Wow.
we know. Now, that means this is one of the biggest predicate offenses to money laundering. right?
Hmm.
Or if you like the US term, this is a specified unlawful act, SUA. It's one of the big ones. Now, it's not just the exploitation of human beings for sex and labor. There is a slew of other sorts of crimes, just like any other criminal enterprise. There is an intersection usually of fraud, of identity fraud, of what we
Hmm.
call forced criminality. So now the victims, if they don't meet their quota or to enhance their revenue, the victims will who are serving all these clientele at night, they might be forced to go and steal merchandise during the day. And then their accounts are used, and I've seen this in many Canadian cases, their accounts are used to conduct check fraud and all sorts of wire fraud and all of that. And they're the ones who have charges on their rap sheet. So there is this intersectionality between, I find, between drug trafficking, especially on the West Coast where you are, and human trafficking and fraud, and even narcotics trafficking and like any kind of gang related activity. Because here you have a surplus of revenue, which you can now use in any way you like.
Well, and then you have a free pool of labor
Mm,
to if that and a free pool of labor that shields you from potential criminal, or that gives you some layer of protection from potential criminal charges, as it were. It's funny. I as we're talking through this, I remember a case out of Ontario a handful of years ago where there was a home listed by
mm,
somebody fraudulently, and it turned out that that person was being trafficked. There was no question that that person was forced into that activity. They had nothing to do with the actual fraudulent selling of the house, made none of the proceeds of it, and they were just being used as the pawn in the whole kind of scheme.
mm.
So it definitely, I have seen this case in the media, so it definitely is happening in Canada. And I wanted to kind of step back to that because I don't think we'd fully tied that knot together. So,
You also
um,
asked me about what it looks like, I think,
yeah,
earlier.
that's
Yeah,
that's where I think the
indicators.
next place. What if I'm conducting my business? I'm a mortgage broker. I'm a real estate broker. My day to day practice, doing whatever it looks like. What is it going to look like for me, and how might I be helpful in this whole thing?
Mm. Let's talk about some behavioral red flags first, and then we'll talk about money laundering indicators too.
Sure.
So, behaviorally, suppose you're a realtor. Uh, you go to a place, and if you're aware of the general signs of vulnerability, let's forget that you're looking at different types of trafficking, because here you could be exposed to sex trafficking or minor trafficking, child abuse material production of that, which usually happens in a person's home because it's usually the family, right, that's
Hmm.
conducting this activity. Now, what are the signs of vulnerability? These are things that are good to know. So you have a very average looking people in a home, but then one person stands out. One
Mm.
person looks vulnerable, malnourished, afraid. They don't seem to really belong there. Or you may see multiple people if you're looking at a pimp controlled place. You may see that this one is really interesting. You may see that there are internal locks in a
Hmm.
big house,
This one
or
really stuck with me, and I was thinking about this because I've shown many homes over the years that I thought were just student housing, and
Mhm.
there's locks on all of the internal bedroom doors, excuse me. But this has stuck with me because I have seen these houses and I thought, it's probably student housing. It never even would have occurred to me until our conversation that this is something that might be an indicator that should at least cause me to think a little bit more about it. But and I don't want to interrupt completely, so please carry on because these are super useful. But I really wanted to highlight that. So,
No, thank you for that interjection. And that reminds me, it's just like a list of indicators. When you get them from FinTrack, a single indicator alone wouldn't tell you what you're looking at. So you need a
hmm.
very comprehensive understanding. And that's why looking at people and their behavior, if something sticks out to you and somebody, that look of vulnerability when you see a person, a troubled child, a bullied child, you know that you're looking at somebody who needs help but may not quite believe that he's a victim or she's a victim herself.
Mm.
Then there are some tattoos, like I said, pimps. or traffickers would have typical tattoos. We know at least what some of them look like. Maybe we can add them to show notes later, but you have these crown tattoos. They are very, or were very popular at least a couple of years ago, and still might be. You have usually like someone's initials followed by the money, the dollar sign, or like I've even seen something like property of this person. And tattoos in strange places too, like here, closer to their chest area or their shoulders. And then there is this question about injuries, like if there is force involved. In typical cases, no trafficker wants to damage their products. And pardon me for sounding so coarse. I think because I speak to a lot of survivors, like this is the language I pick up on, but no trafficker wants to
Yeah.
do that. So when the beatings happen, when the disciplining happens, same with children, it's usually going to happen in unusual places like buttocks, or like the back that people are not exposed to, their thighs. Or sometimes if there are signs of being dragged, then you see the knees can be scraped, but that can happen to an average person. And
Mhm.
then if you're looking at a victim who's dealing with a lot of buyers seem to exert force on their victims, I want to say. And that's when you might see some typical injuries, like you have the wrist injuries when people are restrained.
Ah,
Um,
so that one
yeah.
could be visible to somebody just, I'm thinking through some of these indicators and I don't often see the buttocks of my clients. But probably better that way. But certainly the wrists, that's easy to observe. And, if I were thinking through a situation where, you go into that house and maybe somebody does look like they're out of place, and then you observe the locks on the doors,
Mm,
maybe then I would start to pay attention to the wrists. And hey, if
mm.
there's some bruising on the wrists or some chafing on the wrists, that would be another, like, I'm starting to paint a puzzle here that starts to look compelling uh, and
Yeah,
scary.
and like cigarette burns, like a lot of buyers have this paraphilia, it's a very popular paraphilia. But you know what really has stood out to me in my experiences? A victim who's truly a victim doesn't have a lot of personal possessions. So you might see someone has all her clothes in a garbage bag, and that means she's a transient person. And
Mm.
now she's using a room, and all you see is a garbage bag. Or someone who's wearing PJs in a very casual setting, but then she doesn't have regular comfortable shoes, so PJs and a pair of heels while she's limping, like all of these signs.
Wow. Okay.
Now, we've mostly talked about sex trafficking, but what about labor trafficking? I think I was asking you if you ever run into, like, say, new properties or new buildings, if you ever look at labor workers there. So that's one place where you could find people who are scared or malnourished, again, people who look extremely exhausted. And I'll give you an example. If you go to a really nice resort in the Bahamas, you may not notice this, but say you go to a relatively like average, below average resort in the Dominican Republic, you will see a lot of migrant Haitian workers.
Mm.
They're extremely exploited for labor. They have 15-hour shifts. See if you can have a conversation with them in French Creole, and you'll come to see the signs of labor trafficking. So that's what a construction worker looks like when they're forced. But then they're also living in residential properties, right? Like with all the
Yeah.
cases we've seen, one in Hamilton, Ontario, about I think 10 years ago, actually. Yeah. One of the survivors I know very well, he was extracted from that ring. This was a family in Hamilton, and they were in the construction business. They had about 15 to 20 Hungarian men in their basement, right? Sleeping on these mattresses. And all of them had interacted with a major Canadian bank because they'd all opened these debit accounts where they were collecting some sort of benefit. I don't remember which one it was, and
Sure.
the traffickers had access to their debit cards in their bedroom. So like you might see some of these signs, like why are there so many mattresses in the basement?
I was going to say that's a really good one that you could easily, as a realtor, you go through a house for whatever reason, thinking listing it, working with a buyer, whatever it is. That would that wouldn't necessarily have stood out without this background of how that actually plays out in real life in our Canadian society already. That's a fascinating indicator for sure. You had we talked a little bit about behavioral stuff, and I think that's probably where I think it is realtors and mortgage brokers have the most opportunity to learn, because realtors do actually physically get into homes, and there is some stuff there. We've talked a little bit about that, but the behavioral stuff was interesting too. And I think one of the things you had mentioned when we first talked was around this idea of like somebody clearly puppet mastering a transaction from, and maybe not ever being present during showings. Walk me through why that might be important as an indicator.
Okay, so you're looking at an organized crime here. And let's talk about the most successful of human traffickers. We'll get into like particular types of human trafficking in a bit, sex trafficking in a bit, but let's just say an average trafficker can make $1 to $2 million a year per victim. And if there are
Whoa,
multiple victims, that's a lot of money.
that's a lot of
So
money. Yeah.
that's a lot of money they have to move. But that also means to manage all of these victims and this business enterprise, they also have a lot of conspirators or a lot of brokers, nominees, all of that. So it's
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Know Your Compliance podcast. If you'd like more information about our guests, have a story idea, or want to be a guest, please reach out to hello@kycpodcast.com. If you want to discuss your anti-money laundering compliance needs with a member of the Really Trusted team, go to www.reallytrusted.com/consult.